Now, the purpose of the Bible is to testify of Jesus Christ. The Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, points to Christ.
The Bible is true in a very strange way. What you do as an educated person is sample that structure that constitutes the sum total of the texts of our civilization.
Because if those four things are true, that there's truth, that God exists, that miracles are possible, and the New Testament is reliable enough to let us know that the resurrection occurred, then Christianity is true. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, game over, Christianity is true.
So, what is the food you give to the soul? It is reading the Bible, the Word of God. And I don't care who you are, you cannot live a victorious life if you neglect Bible reading and Bible study.
But what we have at stake here is far more than that. You know, your life depends on this book. So read it.
The Pulpit Commentary, Chapter 18, Section 3, Chapter 18. Moral uncleanness and its punishment. This being the subject of the three following chapters, chapters 18 through 20. They naturally form a sequence to chapters 11 through 17, which have dealt with ceremonial uncleanness and its purification. It is a remarkable thing that, except by implication in connection with the sin offerings, and the trespass offerings, and the ceremonies of the Day of Atonement, there has not yet been a single moral precept, as such, in the book of Leviticus, and there has been very little recognition of sin as distinct from pollution. All has been ceremonial, but the ceremonial is typical of the moral, and from the consideration of ceremonial uncleanness and its remedy, we now proceed to the consideration of moral uncleanness and its penalty. It is to be noticed too that, while the ensuing laws are commanded as the positive injunction of God, verses 2 and 30, which of itself is sufficient to give them their authority and force, they are still founded, like the ceremonial prohibitions, upon the feelings of repugnance implanted in the mind of man. To enter into the marriage relation with near relatives is abhorrent to a sentiment in mankind so widely spread that it may be deemed to have been originally universal. And the same abhorrence is entertained towards other foul sins of lust. Ugliness, which creates disgust by its ugliness, symbolizes sin immorality, which inspires abhorrence by its immoral character, proves itself thereby to be sin. The section deals first with sin in the marriage relation, next with sexual impurities connected with marriage, then with other cases of immorality, and lastly with the penalties inflicted on these sins in their character of crimes. Verses 1 through 5 form an introduction to the Hebrew code of prohibited degrees of marriage and of forbidden sins of lust. The formal and solemn declaration, "I am the Lord your God," is made 3 times in these 5 verses. This places before the people the 2 thoughts: 1, that the Lord is holy, and they ought to be like him in holiness; 2, that the Lord has commanded holiness, and they ought to obey him by being holy, because the Lord is their God, and they are his people. They are, negatively, to refrain from the vicious habits and lax customs prevalent in the land of Egypt wherein they dwelt, and in the land of Canaan whither they were going, the sensuality of which is indirectly condemned by the injunctions which command purity in contrast to their doings, and, positively, they are to keep God's statutes and his judgments, as laid down in the following code, which if a man do, he shall live in them. The latter clause is of special importance, because it is repeated in the same connection by Ezekiel chapter 20 verses 11, 13, and 21, and in the Levitical confession in the book of Nehemiah chapter 9 verse 29, and is quoted by St. Paul in a controversial sense Romans chapter 10 verse 5, Galatians chapter 3 verse 12. Its full meaning is that by obedience to God's commands man attains to a state of existence which alone deserves to be called true life, the life which connects him with Jehovah through his obedience. Clark. And this involves the further truth that disobedience results in death. Accordingly, St. Paul uses the text as being the testimony of the law with regard to itself, that salvation by it is of works in contrast with faith. Compare Luke chapter 10 verse 28. We have no evidence to tell us what were the doings of the land of Canaan in respect to the marriage relation, but this chapter is enough to show that the utmost laxity prevailed in it. And we may be sure that their religious rites, like those of Midian, Numbers 25, were penetrated with the spirit of licentiousness. With regard to the doings of the land of Egypt, we have fuller information. We know that among the Egyptians marriage with sisters and half-sisters was not only permissible, but that its propriety was justified by their religious beliefs, and practiced in the royal family. Other abominations condemned in this chapter verse 23 also, as we know, existed there. Herod, Volume 2, page 46, and if queens could be what in later times Cleopatra was, we may imagine the general dissoluteness of the people. Among Persians, Medes, Indians, Ethiopians, and Assyrians, marriage with mothers and daughters was allowed. And from the time of Cambyses, marriage with a sister was regarded as lawful. Herod, Volume 3, page 31. The Athenians and Spartans permitted marriage with half-sisters. All these concessions to lust and ether unclean acts with which the heathen world was full. Verse 22, Romans 1 verse 27. Were fallings away from the law of purity implanted in the heart of man, and now renewed for the Hebrew people. Verse 6. The next 13 verses contain the law of incest, or the prohibited degrees of marriage. The positive law of marriage, as implanted in the human heart, would be simply that any man of full age might marry any woman of full age, provided that both parties were willing. But this liberty is at once controlled by a number of restrictions, the main purpose of which is to prevent incest, which, however much one nation may come to be indifferent to one form of it, and another to another, is yet abhorrent to the feelings and principles of mankind. The Hebrew restrictive law is contained in one verse. None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him to uncover their nakedness. I am the Lord. All that follows verses 9 through 18 is simply an amplification and an explanation of the words, near of kin to him. These words would be literally rendered, flesh of his flesh, or less probably as in the margin, remainder of his flesh. They certainly include within the compass of their meaning those that are near by affinity, as much as those that are near by consanguinity. This is proved by the instances given below, where no difference is drawn between blood relations and relations by marriage, the latter being supposed to become the former, in consequence of the marriage that has taken place. Nearness of kin is generally counted by degrees, but, unfortunately, this word is itself ambiguous, for it is used in different senses by canonists and by civilians, so far as the direct line is concerned. The same method of calculation is observed by the canon and by the civil law. There is 1 degree from the son to the mother, 2 degrees to the grandmother, 1 degree from the father to the daughter, 2 degrees to the granddaughter. But this is not so with the collateral lines. A brother and sister, for example, are regarded by the canon law as in the 1st degree of kinship, because there is only 1 step to the father, in whom their blood meets. But the civil lawyers consider them as being in the 2nd degree, because, as they calculate, there is 1 step from the brother to the father, and a 2nd from the father to the sister. An aunt is, according to the canonists, in the 2nd degree of propinquity. because there are 2 steps from her nephew to his grandfather, who is likewise her father, in whom their blood unites, but, according to the civilian's calculation, there are 3 steps, namely, from her nephew to his grandfather 2 steps, and a third from that grandfather to his daughter the aunt, and therefore the aunt and nephew are in the 3rd degree of propinquity. The case of an uncle and niece is exactly the same as that of a nephew and aunt, on the same principle, according to the canonists. First cousins are in the 2nd degree of kinship according to the civilians, in the 4th. Propinquity by affinity is calculated in just the same way, so that the brother's wife is in the same degree of relationship as the brother, and wife's sister as the sister by blood, in the code before us, confirmed by that in Deuteronomy. Marriage is forbidden with the following blood relations: mother verse 7, daughter verse 17, sister verse 9, Leviticus chapter 20 verse 17, Deuteronomy chapter 27 verse 22, granddaughter verse 10, aunt verses 12 and 13, Leviticus chapter 20 verse 19. And with the following relations by affinity: mother-in-law verse 17, chapter Leviticus 20 verse 14, Deuteronomy chapter 27 verse 23, daughter-in-law verse 15, Leviticus chapter 20 verse 12, brother's wife verse 16, Leviticus chapter 20 verse 21, stepmother verse 8, chapter 20 verse 11, Deuteronomy chapter 22 verse 30, see Genesis chapter 49. Verse 4, 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 1, stepdaughter and step-granddaughter verse 17, uncle's wife, or aunt by marriage verse 14, Leviticus chapter 20 verse 20, putting aside for the present the question of who is meant by a wife to her sister, in verse 18. In these lists, according to the canonists' method of reckoning, the mother, the daughter, and the sister are related in the 1st degree of consanguinity, the wife's mother, the wife's daughter, the stepmother, the daughter-in-law, the brother's wife, are related in the 1st degree of affinity. The granddaughter and the aunt are in the 2nd degree of consanguinity, the wife's granddaughter, and the uncle's wife in the 2nd degree of affinity, according to the civilian's reckoning. The following would be the degrees of propinquity: the mother and the daughter would be in the 1st degree of consanguinity, the wife's mother, the wife's daughter, the stepmother, the daughter-in-law, would be in the 1st degree of affinity. The sister and the granddaughter would be in the 2nd degree of consanguinity, the brother's wife, and the wife's granddaughter would be in the 2nd degree of affinity. The aunt by blood would be in the 3rd degree of consanguinity, and the uncle's wife, or aunt by marriage, would be in the 3rd degree of affinity. The wife's sister, with regard to whom it is questioned whether she is referred to or not in verse 18, is in the 1st degree of affinity, a man's wife being regarded as himself, according to the canonists' reckoning, and in the 2nd according to the civilians. There is no mention made in the code of the grandmother, the niece, and the cousin german. All of these are in the 2nd degree of consanguinity according to the canon law. And according to the civil law, the grandmother would be in the 2nd degree, the niece in the 3rd, and the cousin german in the 4th. It may reasonably be supposed that by the expression, "None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him, to uncover their nakedness," intercourse is forbidden between all those who are related by consanguinity or affinity in the 1st and 2nd degrees according to the canonists' reckoning, except cousins german, whose case is considered below in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd degrees according to the civilian's method of calculating whether they are mentioned by name in the list or not. It is only by implication, not by direct injunction, that marriage even with a daughter is forbidden. Verse 17. Verses 7 and 8, incest with a stepmother is placed next after that with a mother. On account of the unity caused by marriage, they shall be one flesh. Genesis chapter 2 verse 24. The stepmother's nakedness is the father's nakedness. The tie of affinity is thus declared to be similar in its effects to the tie of consanguinity. Reuben's sin, by which he forfeited his birthright, is connected with this offense, but is of a more heinous character. As his father was alive at the time of his transgression, Genesis chapter 49 verse 4. It is one of the sins which Ezekiel enumerates as those which brought the judgment of God on Israel. Ezekiel chapter 22 verse 10. That one should have his father's wife is declared by St. Paul to be such fornication as is not named among the Gentiles, and to call for the excommunication of the offender. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verses 1 through 5. Adonijah's marriage with Abishag, so strongly resented by Solomon on political grounds, is not denounced as morally reprehensible, probably because Abishag was not the wife of David in such a way as to cause the marriage with his son to be abominable in the eye of the law. Compare 1 Kings chapter 1 verse 4 with Amos chapter 2 verse 7. Absalom's going in unto his father's concubines was regarded as the final act which made reconciliation with his father impossible. 2 Samuel chapter 16 verse 22, 2 Samuel chapter 20 verse 3. The history of the church has shown that marriage with the stepmother has had to be again and again prohibited by council after council. See Smith and Chetham's Dictionary of Antiquities, Prohibited Degrees. Verse 9. In the third place, incest with a sister is forbidden, and it is specifically stated that under the term sister is meant the half-sister, the daughter of thy father, or thy mother, born at home, as would naturally be the case if she were the father's daughter, or born abroad, that is, the daughter of the mother by a previous marriage, when she belonged to a different household. Tamar's appeal to Amnon, I pray thee speak unto the king, for he will not withhold me from thee, exhibits to us the poor woman grasping at any argument which might save her from her half-brother's brutality, and does not indicate that such marriages were, in the time of David, permissible. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 29. The exact degree of relationship which existed between Abraham and Sarah is not altogether certain. Compare Genesis 20 verse 12 with Genesis chapter 11 verse 29. Ezekiel reckons this sin in the catalogue of the iniquities of Jerusalem. Ezekiel chapter 22 verse 11. Verse 10. The fourth case of incest which is prohibited is that with a granddaughter, whether the daughter of son or daughter, for, as they are descended from the grandfather, theirs is thine own nakedness. Verse 11. Incest with a half-sister on the father's side is again forbidden. Perhaps the prohibition refers to the son by a first marriage, whereas verse 9 treats of the son by a second marriage. Keel. Verses 12 through 15. Fifthly, incest with a paternal or maternal aunt is forbidden. Sixthly, with an aunt by marriage. Seventhly, with a daughter-in-law. The last of these finds its place in Ezekiel's catalogue of abominations. Ezekiel chapter 22 verse 11. Compare Genesis chapter 28 verses 18 and 26. Verse 16. The eighth ease of incest is intercourse with a brother's wife. Yet this is commanded under certain circumstances in the book of Deuteronomy, and was practiced in patriarchal times. Genesis chapter 38 verse 8. The following are the circumstances under which it is commanded. If brethren dwell together, and one of them die, and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger, her husband's brother shall go in unto her, and take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother unto her. Deuteronomy chapter 25 verse 5. It has been asked, how can the same thing be forbidden as immoral in Leviticus, and commanded as a duty in Deuteronomy? Bishop Wordsworth replies, in a special case, for a special reason applicable only to the Jews. God was pleased to dispense with that law, and in the plenitude of his omnipotence to change the prohibition into a command. God cannot command anything that is sinful. For sin is transgression of the law, 1 John chapter 3 verse 4. And whatever he commands is right. But it would be presumptuous to say that we may dispense with God's law concerning marriage, because he in one case dispensed with it, as it would be impious to affirm that murder is not immoral, and may be committed by us, bemuse God, who is the sole arbiter of life and death, commanded Abraham to slay his son Isaac. The Levite marriage was not a concession to the desires of the second brother, but a duty enjoined for a family or tribal purpose, and it was plainly at all times most distasteful. Thus Onan refused to perform his duty to heir his wife. Genesis chapter 38 verse 9. The legislation in Deuteronomy anticipates objection on the part of the brother, and institutes an ensuing ceremony to be gone through by him if he declines to do his duty to his dead brother. Deuteronomy chapter 25 verses 9 and 10, which we see carried out in some of its details in the case of Ruth's kinsman Ruth, chapter 4 verses 7 and 10. Indeed, in such a marriage, the second husband seems rather to have been regarded as the continuation of the first husband, than as having a substantive existence of his own as a married man. He performed a function in order that the name of his brother, which is dead, may not be put out of Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 25 verse 6, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren. Ruth chapter 3 verse 10. The second husband's position may be compared to that of the concubine presented by Rachel to her husband. Behold my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. Genesis chapter 30 verse 3. The whole object of the rule was that, as the elder brother could not keep up the flintly by begetting an heir, the younger brother should do it for him after his death. Verse 17. The ninth form of incest prohibited is intercourse with a stepdaughter, or step-granddaughter, or mother-in-law. The expression made use of, thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of a woman, and her daughter, covers the case of a man's own daughter. And it is singular that it is only in this incidental manner that it is specifically named, but it has been already disposed of by the general command. None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him, to uncover their nakedness. The daughter being nearest of kin, this command was sufficient without further specification. The niece and probably the wife's sister are forbidden by the same general rule. See following note. Verse 17. The ninth form of incest prohibited is intercourse with a stepdaughter, or step-granddaughter, or mother-in-law. The expression made use of, thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of a woman, and her daughter, covers the case of a man's own daughter. And it is singular that it is only in this incidental manner that it is specifically named, but it has been already disposed of by the general command. None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him, to uncover their nakedness. The daughter being nearest of kin, this command was sufficient without further specification. The niece and probably the wife's sister are forbidden by the same general rule. See following note. Verse 18. Neither shalt thou take a wife to her sister, to vex her, to uncover her nakedness, beside the other in her lifetime. Do these words refer to the marriage of two sisters, or not? It has been passionately affirmed that they do, by those who are opposed to permission being granted for marriage with a deceased wife's sister, and by those who are in favor of that measure, each party striving to derive from the text an argument for the side which they are maintaining. But Holy Scripture ought not to be made a quarry whence partisans hew arguments for views which they have already adopted. nor is that the light in which a commentator can allow himself to regard it. A reverent and profound study of the passage before us, with its context, leads to the conclusion that the words have no bearing at all on the question of marriage with a deceased wife's sister, and thus it may be removed from the area and atmosphere of angry polemics. It is certain that the words translated a wife to her sister may be translated, in accordance with the marginal rendering, one wife to another. The objections made to such a version are arbitrary and unconvincing. It is in accordance with the genius of the Hebrew language to take father, son, brother, sister, in a much wider acceptation than is the case in the Western tongues. Anything that produces or causes is metaphorically a father anything produced, or caused is a son any things akin to each other in form, shape, character, or nature, are brothers and sisters. This is the name given to the loops of the curtains of the tabernacle. Exodus chapter 26 verses 3, 5, and 6, the tenons of the boards. Exodus chapter 26 verse 17. And the wings of the cherubim. Ezekiel chapter 1 verses 11 and 23. Indeed, wherever the expression, a man to his brother, or a woman to her sister, is used, and it is used very frequently in the Hebrew Scriptures, it means not two brothers, or two sisters, but two things or persons similar in kind. This does more than raise a presumption, it creates a high probability that the expression should be understood in the same way here. But a difficulty then arises. If the right reading is, neither shalt thou take one wife to another, does not the verse forbid polygamy altogether? And is not polygamy permitted by Exodus chapter 21 verse 7 through 11, Deuteronomy chapter 21 verses 15 through 17, Deuteronomy chapter 17 verse 17? Certainly, if so important a restriction was to be made, we should expect it to be made directly, and in a manner which could not be disputed. Is there any way out of the difficulty? Let us examine each word of the law. Neither shalt thou take one wife to another to vex, to uncover her nakedness upon her in her lifetime. The two words, to vex, have not been sufficiently dwelt on. The Hebrew tserer means to distress by packing closely together, and so, to vex, or to annoy in any way. Here is to be found the ground of the prohibition contained in the law before us. A man is not to take for a second wife a woman who is likely, from spiteful temper, or for other reasons, to vex the first wife. Rachel vexed Leah, Peninnah vexed Hannah. The first pair were blood relations. The second were not, but under the present law the second marriage would in both cases have been equally forbidden, if the probability of the provocation had been foreseen. It follows that polygamy is not prohibited by the text before us, but that the liberty of the polygamist is somewhat circumscribed by the application of the law of charity. It follows, too, that the law has no bearing on the question of marriage with a deceased wife's sister, which is neither forbidden nor allowed by it. Are we then to conclude that the law of Moses leaves the case of the wife's sister untouched? Not so, for the general principle has been laid down, none of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him, to uncover his nakedness, and, as we have seen, the expression near of kin includes relations by affinity equally with blood relations, as therefore the wife's sister is in the canonists' first degree of affinity, and in the second according to the civilians. It is reasonably inferred that marriage with her is forbidden under the above law, and this inference is confirmed by marriage with the other sister-in-law, the brother's wife being, as the rule, prohibited. It can hardly be doubted that marriage with the grandmother and with the niece both in the second degree of consanguinity according to the canonists, and the third degree according to the civilians, and incest with a daughter are forbidden under the same clause. The present verse completes the Levitical code of prohibited degrees. The Roman code of restrictions on marriage was almost identical with the Mosaic tables. It only differed from them by specifically naming the grandmother and the niece among the blood relations with whom a marriage might not be contracted, and omitting the brother's wife among relatives by affinity. In the time of Claudius, a change was introduced into it, for the purpose of gratifying the emperor's passion for Agrippina, which legalized marriage with a brother's daughter. This legalization continued in force until the time of Constantius, who made marriage with a niece a capital crime. The imperial code and the canon law were framed upon the Mosaic and the Roman tables, and under them no question arose, except as to the marriage of the niece, the decreased wife's sister, and the first cousin. Marriage with the niece was forbidden by Constantius, as we have said, in the year 355, on penalty of capital punishment for committing the offense. And marriage with a deceased wife's sister was declared by the same emperor to be null. The canons of councils and the declarations of the chief church teachers are in full accordance with the imperial legislation condemning these marriages without a dissentient voice. The only ease in which no consensus is found is that of the marriage of first cousins. By the earliest Roman law these marriages had been disallowed. Tacitus, Annals, Book 12, Chapter 6, but in the 2nd century BC, they had become common lity, 42:34, and they continued to be lawful till the year AD, or 385, when Theodosius condemned them, and made them punishable by the severest penalties possible. This enactment lasted only 20 years, when it was repealed by Arcadius, AD 404 or 405. No adverse judgment respecting the marriage of first cousins was pronounced by the Church until after the legislation of Theodosius, but it appears that that legislation was promoted at her instance, and from that time forward the tendency to condemn these marriages became more and more pronounced. See the canons of the councils of Agde, Epone, Auvergne, Orleans, Tours, Auxerre in the 6th century, and of the council in Trullo in the 7th century. The reformers of the 16th century in England, entrenching themselves, as usual, behind the letter of Scripture and the practice of the primitive Church, forbade marriages of consanguinity and affinity in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd degrees according to the reckoning of the civil law, and in the 1st and 2nd degrees according to the reckoning of the canon law, excepting those of first cousins, on which the early Christians pronounced no decisive judgment. Verse 19. The marriage restrictions having been laid down, there follows in the 5 next verses the prohibition of 5 sexual impurities unconnected with marriage except by their subject matter. The first is to approach unto a woman to uncover her nakedness, as long as she is put apart for her uncleanness, that is, either for 7 days at the time of her ordinary illnesses, Leviticus chapter 15 verse 19, or any longer time that her illness might last, Leviticus chapter 15 verse 25, or for 40 days after the birth of a man-child, chapter 12 verses 2 through 4, or for 80 days after the birth of a girl, Leviticus chapter 12 verse 5. The penalty for the offense within the 7 days is death if committed willfully, Leviticus chapter 20 verse 18, if fallen into unknowingly. A ceremonial penalty of 7 days uncleanness is incurred, Leviticus chapter 15 verse 24. It is twice referred to by Ezekiel as a gross sin, Ezekiel chapter 18 verse 6, Ezekiel chapter 22 verse 10. Verse 20. The second prohibition is, Thou shalt not lie carnally with thy neighbor's wife, a prohibition already made in other words in the 10 Commandments. The punishment for adultery is death by stoning, chapter 20 verse 10. Deuteronomy chapter 22 verse 22, John chapter 9 verse 5, a more severe penalty than was usually inflicted in other nations. Verse 21, the third prohibition is, Thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech. The words the fire are properly inserted. Though not expressed in the original, compare Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 10, 2 Kings chapter 22 verse 10. What was the nature and purpose of the idolatrous rite in question is, however, uncertain. It is generally assumed that reference is made to the practice of offering children in sacrifice to Molech, Deuteronomy chapter 12 verse 31, Ezekiel chapter 16 verse 20, and Psalm chapter 106 verse 37 being quoted in support of that view. But it is by no means certain that this was the case. It might have been a rite by which children were dedicated to Molech, a baptism by fire, not resulting in the death of the child. Its mention here, in close connection with carnal sins, has led some to regard it as an impure rite. But this is a mistaken inference, for the prohibition of adultery naturally suggests the prohibition of a spiritual unfaithfulness. That it was some kind of idolatrous ceremony is shown by the addition of the words, Neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God. But if the children were burnt to death in honor of the idol from the beginning, we should expect to find a notice of the fact in less ambiguous language than the expression passed through the fire conveys, earlier than the days of Ahaz. It is easy to imagine that what began as a dedication ceremony may have become converted into an absolute sacrifice, retaining still its original designation. Molech was a Canaanitish and Phoenician deity, the name meaning king. Just as Baal means Lord, see Selden, Didi is Cyrus, 1:6. Jarchi, quoted by Wordsworth, describes the idol as made of brass, having the face of an ox, with arms stretched out, in which the child was placed, and burnt with fire, while the priests were beating drums, in order to drown the noise of its shrieks, lest the fathers might be moved with pity thereby. The place where the children were offered, in the later period of the Jewish history, was the valley of Hinnom, Jeremiah chapter 7 verse 31, Jeremiah chapter 32 verse 35, 2 Kings chapter 23 verse 10. Verse 22, the fourth prohibition forbids the sin of Sodom, see Genesis chapter 19 verse 5, Judges chapter 11 verse 22, Romans chapter 1 verse 27, 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 9, 1 Timothy chapter 1 verse 10. The penalty is death, Leviticus chapter 20 verse 13. Verses 24 through 30, these verses contain a warning against the sins of incest and impurity already specified. The reason why the Canaanites were east out before the Israelites was that they were defiled in all these things, and the land was defiled by them. God visited the iniquity of these debased races, and the land itself vomited out her inhabitants on account of their abominations. The fate of the Canaanites was therefore a witness to them of what would be their fate if they did, like them. Defile not ye yourselves in any of these things. Ye shall not commit any of these abominations. That the land spew not you out also, when ye defile it. Special penalties are appointed for particular sins further on. Here there are but two punishments denounced, one for individual sinners, the other national. The individual sinner is to be cut off from the nation by excommunication. For whosoever shall commit any of these abominations, even the souls that commit them shall be cut off from among their people. The nation, if it does not thus purify itself by cutting off from itself the authors of these corruptions, is to perish like the Canaanites. The words vomiteth, verse 25, and spurt out, verse 28, are in that tense of the Hebrew verb which is generally called by grammarians a preterite, but this tense does not necessarily imply a past time, the time referred to depends on the context. The previous verbs, I cast out, I do visit, being present in sense, the two verbs, vomiteth out her inhabitants, and spurred out the nations that were before you, are present also. See introduction.